the Conqueror invades. Now, what do you think William the Conqueror does, really, to humiliate the English? He builds that Tower of London, then he takes all the English lords inside Edward the Confessor's newly built Westminster Abbey at sword point and forces them to acknowledge him as their king, King William I of England, and he is then crowned in that church. And as I mentioned before, he becomes our first numbered king. King William I of England, Duke of Normandy, didn't speak a word of English. That is what makes this the coronation church. Every king and queen of England who has been crowned since that time, not all of them were, was crowned in this church. Now, some of them were also crowned in other churches first, but they're all crowned in this church. This is the coronation church, and Charles, our current king, was crowned in here a couple of years ago. So this is kind of still a royal church, but it's not the church that Edward the Confessor built. How come? And if you look at it, we can tell it can't possibly be that church. Have a look at the entrance. That entrance there has an arched doorway. Now, in Edward the Confessor's time, arches like that didn't exist. That is a Gothic arch. And back in Edward the Confessor's day, they were Romanesque, so we can tell that isn't the original doorway. And then these structures here, which are under repair, well, those are flying buttresses. Again, a hallmark of the Gothic architectural style. So what happened to Edward the Confessor's old church? Let me tell you. Do you remember I told you about King John, who loses all of the French-speaking possessions? The heart of the empire, as far as the aristocracy and royalty here were concerned, it was an absolute disaster. He is forced to sign Magna Carta. Now, supposing you are John, you pass away, and your son here, Henry III, comes to the throne. He does not want to be identified with your legacy. So what does he do? He tries to make a smart move, as Henry III. He says, I'm going to get all the English people to love me, and I'm going to get everybody to regard me as a good and holy king. So what does he do? Well, the English are looking back to the time of Edward the Confessor, that last English king. He's become a symbol of purity, of virtue. He's even venerated as a saint. He's been canonized by the Pope. So Henry has the bright idea of knocking down Edward the Confessor's church and rebuilding it as the grandest and most impressive church in Europe, as a shrine to Edward the Confessor. He thinks everybody's going to love him if he does that. So that's what he does. Do you think everybody does love him? What do you think happens?
Sure.
Okay, so I'll tell you what happens. Halfway through the construction process, there is a revolt against him. It's called the Barons' Revolt, led by a man called Simon de Montfort. Henry III loses against the barons in the Barons' Revolt. He's captured and he is forced to sign further concessions, if you like, additions to Magna Carta. They're called the Provisions of Oxford. Now, under the Provisions of Oxford, the king has to call regular meetings, have regular formal conversations, not just with the lords, the barons, but now also with elected representatives of the common people, from the burgesses and the shires. And what do you think the word for those formal conversations was, and still is?
Parliament.
Exactly. From the French word to speak, parler. So parlements, where are they held? Well, in the palace of the king, next door to the abbey. So the first parliaments are actually held in St. Stephen's Chapel in the Palace of Westminster, which is why Big Ben used to be called St. Stephen's Tower. It honours that tradition. So this church is where democracy in the English-speaking world was born. It's where parliaments come from. So it's a really important building, not just with coronations, but because of the birth of parliaments. It's also kind of our national hall of remembrance. So many important people from our history are either entombed or monumentalized inside this church, including Newton, who is buried here, Darwin, who is buried here, Churchill, who is honoured, they're not buried here, Shakespeare, honoured, they're not buried here, all with beautiful monuments, and George Peabody is a you heard about earlier, and FDR, and Longfellow, and T.S. Eliot, and I think, if I'm right, Benedict Allen, who Americans love to remember as a keen patriot. And all of them remembered or buried inside that church, and many more besides. There are kings and queens also buried in there. Edward the Confessor still there, and around him you got Henry III, Edward I, Henry V, etc., etc. So it's a kind of the centerpiece. Now, it is the Westminster. So this area called Westminster, the city of Westminster, takes its name from that building. So it's the kind of centerpiece of this other bit of London, which begins from 973 AD. So 1,000 years after the bit we've just been into. And because of Westminster, Palace of Westminster, Houses of Parliament, this is also the seat of Parliament and royalty. So should we walk through to where the palaces are? Yeah.